Now, listen, everybody. I've been seeing something recently where the Trotsky-Stalin distinction. I'm seeing this the new discourse among leftists is neutrality. It's pan-leftism. Oh, it doesn't matter. The division between Stalin and Trotsky isn't important. It's just sectarianism. And then on the other hand, you have the actual so-called Marxist-Leninists who are our enemies. They consider Marxism-Leninism to just be a flavor of some general Marxist tendency. It's just a specific flavor. There's no fundamental qualitative difference between Trotskyism and Marxism-Leninism in their view. It's just different flavors of the same tendency. So this is the pan-leftist form of opportunism, and it reflects how much the decisive and qualitatively unique significance of Marxism-Leninism doesn't exist in any Western countries. It doesn't exist in the USA. There are different flavors of Trotskyism. Anyone who believes that this issue is of no decisive significance is just a Trotskyite, because Marxist-Leninists uniquely recognize a distinction that Trotskyites are not even capable of recognizing. You see, from the Trotskyite perspective, Marxism-Leninism is not a unique tendency. It's not a different principle. They don't even recognize it. They dismiss it and pin it all to Stalin's authoritarian opportunism and conniving and manipulation. And it's just some justification for the corruption of the degenerated worker state. The Trotskyites cannot see Marxism-Leninism, but Marxist-Leninists can see Trotskyites. So when they say, oh, the division isn't important, it's just different flavor. No. There's a qualitative distinction that only Marxist-Leninists can recognize. So anyone who calls himself a Marxist-Leninist running around thinking it's okay to fraternize with Trotskyites at a political level and have united fronts with them or whatever is not a Marxist-Leninist. They're just a Trotskyite who have third worldist tendencies. It's a pretty common phenomena in the USA. And I'm actually going to explain the decisive significance of Marxism-Leninism, not from the dry perspective of theory, which clearly doesn't do enough to communicate or convey distinctions of a qualitative nature, which is more a kind of message of, in a sense, resignation and acceptance of the fact that the apocalypse already happened, that the big event, the big revolution already happened, and now you have to take responsibility. Early socialist realism in the USSR had a very liminal and apocalyptic vibe, which was a bridge between the chaos of the 20s and this new morning, this new somber awakening to this new, not as exciting, more mundane, but, kind of things settling back into place. And it has a very kind of somber tone to it. They're usually paintings of factories and so on, but they're not extremely realistic, because they have impressionistic qualities, right? This was the early socialist realist works of art, and that was the liminal space between the avant-garde of the 20s and the transition into the kind of Stalinist orthodox form of art. And I think that's where you understand the qualitative rupture that happens with Marxism-Leninism. Now, remember, Stalin was just Lenin's most faithful student, but Lenin's qualitative rupture with social democracy did not acquire cultural, ideological, political, and so on expression until Stalin. Before then, the only people who comprehended correctly the genius of Lenin was Lenin himself in his own head, Lenin's comrades who knew him, and of course, the strategies Lenin employed to seize power showed for themselves. But the Leninist philosophy, the Leninist outlook, the Leninist aesthetic, the Leninist sensibility did not acquire any reality until Stalin, until Stalin's specific form of socialist construction that was pursued in the late 20s. That's what drew out the decisive and qualitative rupture between Leninism and the social democracy of the past. Now, I have a thesis that I would like to, and I want you guys to take notes here. So next time someone asks you what's so important about the Stalin-Trotsky split, you can take notes. The importance of the Stalin-Trotsky split is that Trotsky represents a deranged and psychopathic mutation of social democracy. Trotsky did not throw off the prejudices of social democracy. Rather, on the basis of these prejudices, he drew logical conclusions that were, sure, very extreme and revolutionary sounding, but they still rested upon the conceptual premises that were built by orthodox Marxism within social democracy. Now, as Stalin writes in the Foundations of Leninism, Lenin added qualitative contributions to Marxism. Lenin, according to Stalin, was not just a Marxist. He added, there is a qualitatively new contributions added to Marxism by Lenin and Leninism. Hence, that's why it's called Marxism-Leninism. You understand? So Trotsky does not join Lenin in this transition from Orthodox Marxism. Trotsky stays there. He just draws logical conclusions from Orthodox Marxism that end up contradicting the leaders of social democracy. But he still retains the urbanistic, Eurocentric, conceptually rigid, and fundamentally idealist assumptions and premises of European social democracy. Trotsky absolutely does. I'll give you an example of this. His notion of the construction of socialism and revolution as an act by the more advanced seat of consciousness in the towns and the cities that proceeds first, and then the backward kind of agrarian rural masses come second. Yeah, that's from that's not even from Trotsky. That's from Orthodox Marxism, from social democracy. That was the view, that you have to wait until the full urbanization happens, where everyone becomes like England, basically, becomes modernized and civilized, and then the revolution occurs in the most advanced core, right? Trotsky shared that assumption in principle. He did have his notion of a combined and uneven development, but according to Trotsky, these were just unique conditions under which the urban proletariat would have to maneuver the situation within the Russian Empire to acquire absolute and total dominance over all other sectors of society, including the peasant majority. And the implications of Trotsky's outlook was a revolutionary war against 90% of your own population, the peasants, right? In effect, not that he advocated this, but in effect, that was the conclusion of Trotsky. He wanted to go to war with the majority of the people that lived in Russia, the peasants, because they didn't fit the social democratic mold. Now, social democratic Orthodox Marxism is what you call Anglo-box Marxism. In the Orthodox Marxist and social democratic comprehension, you have a box that says this is what the proletariat is, this is what capitalism is, this is what socialism is, this is what history is in its stages. And it was an Anglo-box kind of Marxism, right? In Russia, they couldn't fit the box of Orthodox Marxism. It didn't fit the category. So that's why there was a unique development of Marxism in Russia to answer the question of, well, we have a revolutionary peasantry. It doesn't fit the mold of Orthodox Marxism, so how do we make sense of that? Lenin is the one who does that. But in order to do that, Lenin has to contradict some of the assumptions of Orthodox social democracy, such as, for example, the idea that the proletariat is a conceptual ideal whose correlate is a specific instantiated on a geographic, cultural, whatever level, demographic. Lenin had a much more dynamic understanding of class contradictions. In Lenin's understanding of class contradictions, there's an active process of class genesis, where distinctions, we call it class schizogenesis, right? Where class distinctions are continually and newly being engendered and developed from the countryside. And that's actually the decisive point of class struggle. The proletariat that is established, and the bourgeoisie that's established for that matter, are not the sole revolutionary subject. The primary revolutionary subject is the rural masses. That was Lenin's notion, and Trotsky didn't agree with that. Trotsky thought that the established proletariat was the proletariat, and that the peasantry were just one big stupid mass. Maybe the poorest among them could show some revolutionary potential, but ultimately they were backward, stunted, and could not be trusted with any kind of leadership over the revolutionary process and in terms of their participation. So that was Trotsky's perspective. And you can see how these assumptions about what revolution is, what Marxism is, play out in the Western context. Because the Trotskyites in Western countries, whether they call themselves Stalinists or Maoists or anything, they're all Trotskyites because they all share this assumption. For example, now you understand the qualitative distinction is about the dialectic of form. Because it's very simple. If rural masses in the USA, if country bumpkins are bigoted and they're not saying the right things, they're not articulating their spontaneous class consciousness in ways that fit the categories of academics and advanced people, then they should all be written off. They're backward and they don't fit the mold. They don't fit the Anglo box description of what a revolutionary subject is. They're bigoted. They have bad ideologies. They say the wrong things. They articulate themselves in the wrong way. They don't fit the mold. Therefore, they should be written off. That's the Trotskyite view of Marxism. That's the social democratic view of Marxism. The social democratic view of Marxism is institutional Marxism. It holds the view that this wilderness of barbarians that are outside of the institutions need to be culled, they need to be reined in and dominated by urban institutions, who know better, by experts, by glasses wearers. That is the decisive significance of Trotskyism, the domination of the rural masses by established urban elites. So you see, there is a qualitative distinction between Marxism-Leninism and Trotskyism. That's actually very important because it's a deciding factor that absolutely differentiates what the application of Marxism looks like as different as night and day. So much so that we don't even consider Trotskyite organizations to be our rivals. We get upset when people confuse us with the RCA, but the RCA are not rivals because they are not even Marxists. They're no different than Patriot Front, to be honest. It's like, in terms of their ideological difference, maybe not in terms of their hatefulness or whatever, but they're that far from us. It's a completely different comprehension of Marxism. So much so that you're basically talking about the only similarities. Sometimes we use the same words. That's it. But it's a decisive distinction to maintain and uphold between Marxism, Leninism, and Trotskyism. And why am I disappointed? And sometimes when I see the community's response to the pan-leftist argument, all I see you guys say, and I don't have anyone specifically in mind, I saw this was a random gorilla in the replies that said this. A random gorilla I don't even remember. But when your only argument is that, the neocons, that's not the strongest argument. It's true, but don't just say that we're against Trotskyism because of the neocons. We're against Trotskyism because the recognition of the unique contribution to Marxism Lenin made, and Marxism-Leninism in particular, cultivating that type of consciousness and that type of sensibility is a very methodical, meticulous, and particular kind of work that just hasn't been done in the USA. It's a subtle dialectical outlook, which is absolutely a kind of somber, very sober realism, which balances the fire of revolutionary sentiment with a very cold, realistic, even melancholic outlook that's very balanced. It's a very sage-like perspective, which has an extreme level of patience toward the contradictions within reality, combined with an extreme decisiveness and willingness to act in response to them. This has nothing to do with the pan-leftist or Trotskyite outlook, which is about abolish everything, abolish, and shouting and screaming and resenting the world, more or less, wanting to annihilate everything on the altar of the pure form of revolution. You're talking about something very different. Revolutionary leftists in the USA, they are Trotskyites, all of them, because their whole idea is that they're going to abolish the world and abolish reality itself, and that's because everything is so unjust or out of whack with respect to what they consider needs to be. The world is not in conformity with their ideals, so therefore the world has to be abolished. The Marxist-Leninist or Stalinist outlook has nothing to do with that. It's very different. The Marxist-Leninist or Stalinist outlook is in practice more revolutionary because it doesn't begin with the premise of abolishing reality. It begins with the premise that reality is on our side and that we just have to respond correctly to reality in spite of appearances, in spite of prejudices and conventions, and we will win. That's the Stalinist way. So, for example, the Stalinist way can get past the one, what's funny about revolutionary leftism, they abolished everything too quickly. We're going to abolish bedtime, we're going to abolish the family, we're going to abolish everything. Whoopsie, you abolished your ability to create hierarchical collective organizations that exist in the real world. You've abolished reality itself. You're the Stirnerites who have abolished everything in your head and declared your own victory. In order to accomplish the square one of just building an organization, you have to ditch those childish sentiments because you do have to acquiesce to the realism of hierarchy, of collectivism, of putting your opinions behind the concrete and pressing tasks of the organization. You don't put your opinions first. You don't put your individual point of view first. You put the principle of collective organization first. And that's that's the step one. They can't even do that. There are Trotskyite cults that exist and sects. RCA is one of them. And what do? They march with flags, a lot of flags, and they yell. And that's their way of abolishing reality. They're marching with flags on the street, yelling, in the hopes that people will be so overwhelmed that it'll change reality itself because of how much they're shouting at it. They've created, they've created the industrial army, the super industrial army, right? Trotsky wanted to use the military to industrialize Russia. That's what they're creating, but with the media. And everyone's just gonna bow before the shouting and stuff, and it's gonna solve everything, right? So, guys, this is what we're talking. You need to really appreciate the distinction as qualitative. You can't just say these are different, these are petty squabbles. Oh, but Stalin-Trotsky dispute doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Everything rests on that. The most disgusting people are the ones who say socialism in one country was just kind of like a temporary solution because they had to kind of sacrifice their principles for the circumstances. No, it was based on a different principle of understanding of what socialism was qualitatively. Socialism in one country was not like some opportunistic sacrifice of principle for the sake of, adapting to the situation. Socialism in one country was refounding the comprehension and the content of what socialism is and how socialism develops, from the idea of the most advanced capitalist nations affecting a worldwide simultaneous transition to an understanding that socialism is built from already existing and determinate social formations, countries, and the development of socialism through the particular is what will inspire others to follow the example. Very different from the Trotskyite interpretation of a simultaneous global revolution which all at once wipes away capitalism and creates a world socialist country. There's a dialectical wisdom in the Stalinist logic. You begin from the particular, actually. The particular becomes the receptacle of the universal world spirit. And this is how socialism is developed. Socialism takes on a particular form. The form is not itself universal. See, that's a very important distinction, and I'll tell you why. And this is where it kind of does go back to the neoconservatives. Because if you don't think socialism takes on a particular form, and you think there's some universal form that's correct, that's a universal form that you see fit to impose on the world, regardless of differences. Oh, it doesn't matter what your culture is, doesn't matter what your civilization is, doesn't matter what your religion and your values is. There's one simultaneous, universal form of socialism that must be imposed on everyone, regardless of form, and it doesn't take particular form. And there's such a subtle wealth of differences that you can if you just go with this pan-leftist flow, it becomes very superficial and unimportant. But it is very important, actually. Everything rests on that distinction for building communism in a Western country, because America in particular has been infected by Trotskyism for a century. CPUSA was infected by Trotskyism, and understanding what difference is at stake is the same thing as correctly understanding what Marxism-Leninism is in the first place. But once again, I've always reiterated the same argument since the very beginning of infrared. Keep that in mind. Since the very beginning, I've said the same thing. In Western countries, the question of what the concrete context to which Marxism is being applied was never taken for granted. It was always assumed to reflect the reflexive sensibilities of institutions. And therefore, it has always been idealistic. Western Marxism has always been idealistic. It's always been about, we are going to create the context to which we apply Marxism in the university. We're going to create it through thought. We're going to create it through a shared community based on shared ideas, rather than a concrete community whose premises are very much not based on ideas, but based on material existence and material reality. And that distinction is just so extremely important to understand in the context of Trotskyism versus Marxism-Leninism, because remember, Trotskyism shares with social democracy a methodological idealism, which regards the various words and phrases that are associated with Marxism to be conceptual categories that have neat ideal correlates, neat correlates in real life to the ideal. And therefore, there's kind of two variations of this opportunism, this dogmatism, when it comes to understanding, for example, what the proletariat is. One, there's two forms of methodological idealism when it comes to what the proletarian is, defining the proletariat, right? The first one, you could say it's what people try to accuse us of, which is not true, which is this idea that, the form of the proletariat visually of 1800s factory worker, that's all it is, right? So that's a very superficial one that doesn't really exist beyond a straw man. Now, the second one is the most common one, which is a purely conceptual definition of the proletariat that is so abstract, it applies to like everyone, purely based on this abstract definition. It's too inclusive. It's a definition of the proletariat which says I'm going to define this abstractly in my head based on this formula of words, and basically it's creating a door so big that only 5% of people can't walk through it. It's creating this abstraction that is so abstract that it can almost apply to everyone, including CEOs, right? And that's a Trotskyite prejudice, actually, in origin. That's Trotskyism. Because how do Marxist-Leninists define things? Let's say the proletariat. The way Marxist-Leninists would define the proletariat isn't first creating an abstract definition with which to impose on reality in an opportunistic way, like which pan-leftists do. I call it participation trophy proletariat. Proletarian participation trophy. You're a proletarian, we're all proletarians. The Marxist-Leninist way defines it in conjunction, in a way that's responsive to intelligible definitions that are meaningful within reality. By definition, I mean distinctions, different forms and manifestations of existence at the level of the population have to also play a role in your consideration of what a class is. Because otherwise the term class loses meaning. You're going to define a class of the population based on your abstract definition, or based on how functionally and effectively it is a class of the people. Effectively. Meaning not just in your head according to how it conforms to your definition, but according to how it actually affects itself as a class within reality, intelligibly. There needs to be some kind of explanatory value to the idea of class. If it's just whatever fits my definition, like I could say the revolutionary subject are people with left hand, but you have to demonstrate how people who are left-handed, for example, this is a really bad example, impose their significance upon reality as a class. And in a way that like makes them intelligible beyond just fitting your definition. For example, my definition of the revolutionary subject is everyone who pays taxes. Okay, I mean, there are a lot of people who pay taxes and can therefore satisfy and fulfill your definition of what a revolutionary subject is. The problem is actually successfully proving how this group of people is being defined. Are they only being defined in your head as distinct from the rest of the population, or are there ways in which they are distinct that actually and materially reproduce themselves in intelligible ways? So for Marxist-Leninists, there's a dialectic of form and content. You can't just have an abstract form and say the content is whatever fulfills the form. No, form and content work together. Your definition or your form should also reflect the content, deeper content. I should rather say the content should participate in the form. It's not, this is an abstract form, whatever fulfills the form is the content. No! The content needs to actively participate in the intelligibility of the form. That's the Marxist-Leninist and dialectical comprehension, not just of class, but of anything. So don't assume that I saw it's outdated, it doesn't matter in 2025. Of course it matters, because pan-leftism is not a principled basis of organization or affiliation. Pan-leftism isn't a principle. It's a vague affiliation based on people who, we are critical of the Democratic Party, but we're also not Nazis. Hey, that's not specific enough to unite people. The left in the USA is the only political grouping or demographic that doesn't have a concrete subject. It's just purely based on reflexivity. It's purely based on what is to be done. It's not based in anything actually being done, right? It's just based on people who want something new, but don't really have any ideas or cannot link up their principles with anything going on actually in reality, right? So that's a big problem. That's a big, big problem. Yeah, I've talked a lot about that.